It's been over 40 years since the grisly murders of the Keddie cabin. But what exactly happened there? Let's get into it. On June 1981, residents of the Sierra Nevada foothills in California reported seeing smoke rising from the Keddie Creek area, smoke that turned out to be coming from a small cabin where a few days prior, people had been staying. Residents knew the cabin well as it was often rented out by various families throughout the year. It was considered a great place to stay if you wanted some time away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin was located off of Highway 170, which ran through the town of June Lake, a popular tourist spot in the summer. On June, officers from the Mono County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. They soon discovered 4 bodies lying on the floor of the living room inside the cabin. The victims were identified as 39-year-old John Sliegel, his wife, 29-year-old Virginia, their 17-year-old son John Jr., and their 14-year-old daughter Charity. The couple's 9-year-old son, Jason, was nowhere to be found, nor was Glenn Hilbert, a 35-year-old friend of the family who had been staying at the cabin with them. The authorities would later find both missing persons in separate bedrooms. Jason was in his bedroom closet and Hilbert was in the back bedroom, with his hands bound behind his back and his legs spread wide. Medical examiners would determine that all 5 had died of blunt force injuries, likely sustained from a baseball bat or a similar object. None of the victims had any defensive wounds and no signs of sexual assault. Strangely, nothing appeared to be stolen, leading investigators to believe that this was not a robbery gone wrong. All 5 had been in bed when they were attacked. The only unusual things found at the crime scene were the partial fingerprints on the front door, which did not match anyone in the system, and some tire tracks left in the dirt road leading up to the cabin. At first, the police believed the killer had driven a Ford Limited with hubcaps, but the track analysis would later prove inconclusive. A lot of questions were raised about whether or not the murders could have been committed by members of the notorious Manson family. After all, Manson family member Bruce Davis lived in the area at the time and was on parole after serving time for a brutal 1969 murder in Los Angeles. But when the police asked him about the Keddie murders, he claimed to have an alibi. He would later take a lie detector test confirming this. Plus, forensics would turn up no evidence linking the Manson family to the crimes. What made matters worse is that although several locals had seen strange cars in the area around the time of the murders, no one had come forward with any information until almost 2 weeks after the bodies were found. And even then, the witnesses were reluctant to talk to the press. So it's unknown whether these vehicles were connected to the murders or not. This led investigators to believe that whoever committed the murders had done so without drawing any attention to themselves, perhaps because they knew the victims. With the lack of evidence, the police would follow up on hundreds of leads over the next few years, none of which went anywhere. One such lead came from a woman named Mary Sue Kitts, who told investigators that she had been hitchhiking along Highway 395 in June 1981 when she was picked up by a man driving a Ford Limited who offered to drive her to San Francisco. Mary Sue said that while they were driving, the man received a phone call in which he discussed disposing of people in the Sierra National Forest. Mary Sue got creeped out and jumped out of the car, and the driver sped away. She described the driver as being in his mid-20s with long flowing hair and wearing a dirty t-shirt. Unfortunately, Mary Sue couldn't identify the man in a lineup. Another lead came from a former lover of Virginia's, a man named Roy Arnold Coates. He confessed to police that he had argued with Virginia in a phone call shortly before the murders. It seemed like the perfect motive, but Coates passed a polygraph test and there was no physical evidence to link him to the crime scene. One of the more promising leads came from a drifter named Richard Chase, also known as the VCR Killer. Chase had a history of brutally murdering people in California and then recording himself interacting with their dead bodies. In the early 1980s, he was convicted of killing 3 women and a young boy. His defense tried to argue that he wasn't guilty by reason of insanity, but he was sentenced to death anyway. Chase was already in prison when he wrote a letter to the police claiming to have information about the Keddie murders. When the police interviewed him, he said that he knew who did it, but wouldn't tell them unless he was transferred to a prison near the area so he could visit the crime scene. Once the police made the transfer, Chase took them to the exact location where the bodies were found and told them that he had buried the murder weapon nearby. He then led them on a merry chase around the woods, stopping every few minutes to strike dramatic poses on rocks and logs. Eventually, Chase told the cops that he had left the weapon in a cave on the side of a hill, but when they searched the area, they found nothing. Chase would later recant his story. And if you think that's confusing, it gets even more confusing. Another man named Eric Robert Rudolph was also convicted of a series of murders in California. In the late 1980s, during his trial, his public defender claimed that Rudolph had actually committed the murders at the cabin. The defense argued that the similarities between Rudolph S. Moe and the Keddie case were too striking to ignore. However, this theory was never taken seriously by law enforcement. Fast forward to 2003, when the FBI released composite sketches of two men they believed to be responsible for the murders, only adding to the mystery surrounding the case. To this day, nobody knows who these men are or if they're even connected to the case at all. To make things even more mysterious, many weird coincidences surround the case. For example, after the news broke about the murders at the cabin, dozens of locals came forward saying that they had heard gunshots in the area the night before the bodies were found. At first, everyone assumed that these reports were mistaken, but the sheer number of people reporting hearing gunshots forced investigators to take notice. There was also the fact that the cabin had been rented multiple times between May and June by different families, but somehow each time someone tried to book the cabin during that period, they were told it was already rented and they should try again in July. As we know, the bodies would be discovered on June. Who was trying to book the cabin and why has never been determined. Even more strange is that the cabin where the murders occurred was owned by Virginia's parents. Her father was a prominent doctor in the area and her mother, a well-known nurse. Yet despite their status in the community, nobody came forward with any information about who might have wanted to hurt their daughter and grandchildren. The weirdest coincidence of all, though, is that just 8 months before the Keddie cabin murders, another family was found dead in their home in Southern California. The victims were 30-year-old Keith Greenawalt, his wife, 25-year-old Sherry, and their 2 daughters, 9-month-old Heather and 6-year-old Lindsay. All 4 had been bludgeoned to death in their beds. Although the Keddie and Greenawalt cases bear striking similarities, the police have never linked them together. Some believe that the killer in the Keddie case was Charles Manson. After all, he had been released from prison in 1983, just 2 years after the murders. But there's absolutely no evidence to support this claim. Not only did Davis say that Manson wasn't involved, but Manson himself predicted the police would never solve the case. Manson was right. The Keddie case remains unsolved to this day, and it may never be solved. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and come along for more criminal content. Thank you for watching.